Hello, Summit families. Welcome to my backyard. It's too beautiful to be inside, so I thought we could read chapter 6 outside today. I hope there's not too many background noises. The birds are definitely chirping. Things are turning green and trees are budding and things are blooming. So I hope you're getting out to enjoy these nice days and are making the best of these circumstances. So we're gonna read chapter 6 of Humphrey. There's our little friend Humphrey. It's titled Right is Wrong. By the time class started the next morning, my mind was spinning as fast as my hamster wheel, thinking about pirates, sailboats, and the sailing contest. Once class began, however, there was too much going on to think of any of those things. The vocabulary test came first. I had lots of boats on my mind all week, but not spelling. I took the test with my friend, sneaking into my sleeping hut to write in my notebook, but I managed to miss 3 words, including squall. For some reason, I thought there was a W in there, like sprawl or ball. I must admit, I had a little doze during math period. As soon as that was finished, Mr. Brisbane and Mrs. Morgenstern returned, and the sailboat building was in full swing again. I perched near the top of my cage and watched my friends at work. Oh, what lovely sailboats they were. The boat Miranda and Saya were working on looked like a graceful swan. It was a sailboat that curved high on each end. The front part looked like the head of a swan, and the back part looked like tail feathers. The girls were carefully gluing colorful feathers to the sides of the boat. It was quite a sight. AJ and Garth designed an impressive sailboat that had skull and crossbones, pirate flag, which is called the Jolly Roger, like the uncle in the book Mrs. Brisbane was reading to us. Tabitha and Seth were building a Chinese junk. It had several sails. The biggest one was red with a dragon painted on it, and the Viking ship designed by Art and Mandy was beginning to take shape. It was long and low with a square sail and blue and white stripes. But the sailboat to end all sailboats was the one Kirk and Richie were building. It was still early, but I was already thinking they had a good chance of winning the race. Richie was sanding the hull. Kirk was working on the sail. Scritch, 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 went the sandpaper. Richie was really throwing himself into the work when suddenly Kirk pulled the boat up out of his hand. Hold it, Richie. You have to sand it evenly. You're taking way too much off this side. See? Kirk pointed to the side of the boat. Okay, you don't have to grab it like that. Richie, who was usually a happy-go-lucky guy, looked grumpier than I had ever seen him before. Give it back. I'll sand it, said Kirk. I know how to do it. He started sanding while Richie glared at him. I know how to do it too, he told Kirk. Look, Richie, just let me do this. I can practically promise we'll win. Because I know just what to do, Kirk assured his partner. My dad and I built one of these last year. I can at least sand it, Richie protested. But Kirk didn't give in. I'll do it, Kirk said, and we'll get the prize. Kirk kept sanding. He didn't even seem to notice how upset Richie was. After a while, Kirk said, Hey, where do you take a sick sailboat? Who cares, Richie muttered. To the dock, Kirk replied with a big laugh. Get it? To the dock? Richie didn't answer, and he certainly didn't laugh. Gail didn't seem to be enjoying the assignment any more than Richie. Heidi painted the hull while Gail was supposed to design the sail. Mrs. Morgenstern loved all of Heidi's ideas. Oh, look at those squiggles. They look like waves. That's a wonderful theme for a boat, she exclaimed. Then she turned to her daughter. Gail, why don't you do something like this for the sails? Gail didn't smile. She didn't answer either. Mrs. Morgenstern didn't seem to notice. Let your mind go wild. Think mermaids. Think seagulls. Think lighthouses. I don't believe Gail was thinking about any of those things. Luckily, Mandy had a question for Mrs. Morgenstern, who moved away from the table. "Why don't you listen to your mom?" Heidi asked Gail. "If you do what she says, maybe we'll win the prize for the most beautiful boat." Gail stared at the big poster of a sailboat for a very long time. "See the picture on the wall?" asked Heidi at last. "Sure," Heidi answered. "What does it look like?" Heidi thought for a moment. "Well, it's a wooden boat with big white sails." Gail nodded. "And doesn't it look beautiful sailing across the water with those white sails against the blue sky?" "I think so," Heidi said. "I don't think there's anything more peaceful than a sailboat with white sails," Gail explained. "I hate to mess it up with mermaids and seagulls." "But the contest," Heidi protested. Gail sighed. "Okay," she said. "I'll try." She sounded as if she meant it. "I was glad when Mrs. Brisbane had my friends put their boats away until school was over. After the students left, Mrs. Brisbane stayed to tidy up her desk. It was quiet for the first time all day, so I guess I dozed off. I wasn't sleeping for long, though, because I was awakened by a familiar voice loudly saying, 'I think we need to talk about your field trip.'" The voice belonged to Mrs. Wright. A field trip. The voice belonged to Mrs. Wright, said field trip, in the same way she might say bad smell or chicken pox. "Oh, you mean the trip to Potter's Pond?" Mrs. Brisbane asked. Her voice was friendly, but I knew our teacher well enough to know that she was on guard. With Mrs. Wright, it's always a good idea to be on your guard. "Yes, I see you filed the proper form, but I did have some questions," Mrs. Wright explained, "and some concerns. I was concerned that Mrs. Wright was sticking her nose where it didn't belong." "What concerns?" Mrs. Brisbane asked. Mrs. Wright leafed through a stack of papers she had in her hand. Safety concerns, she said. "I need to know that you will have a required number of parent volunteers." "Of course, that's never a problem with this class," Mrs. Brisbane assured her, "and all the students must have signed permission slips, no exceptions." Mrs. Wright said in an ominous tone of voice, "Not one." "Of course," Mrs. Brisbane said. "I'm also concerned about water safety," Mrs. Wright continued. "I'm not sure whether or not we'll need a lifeguard." "If we need one, we'll get one," said Mrs. Brisbane. "But the students weren't swimming, and they're just sailing their boats." Mrs. Wright shuffled papers some more. "Yes, these are model boats, I hope." I don't think Mrs. Wright saw Mrs. Brisbane roll her eyes, but I did. "Very small model boats," she answered. Yes, I see," said Mrs. Wright. "We'll also have to make sure the students are properly dressed. They will need sweaters and possibly boots." Mrs. Brisbane sighed, but Mrs. Wright kept on talking. "Then there's a matter of food. All of the snacks must be approved on the list." She whipped out a piece of paper and handed it to Mrs. Brisbane. "Mrs. Wright," our teacher said, "I have been taking students on field trips for many, many years. I've never had a problem so far." Mrs. Wright smiled. "But it wasn't a nice smile, of course," she said. "But regulations have changed over the years. I couldn't take it anymore. I just had to squeak up. 'Leave her alone,' I shouted, even though it sounded like squeak, squeak, squeak to her. I figured she could tell I wasn't happy. Boing, 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 Og chimed in. I know sometimes I complain about him, but Og always comes through when you need him." "Goodness, what's that noise?" Mrs. Wright asked. "Are you sure those animals are all right?" Mrs. Brisbane ignored the question. "Just give me the forms. I'll make sure they are filled out." "Thank you," Mrs. Wright icily replied. "It's for the student safety, you know." After Mrs. Wright was gone, Mrs. Brisbane paced around the room, making huffing and puffing noises. I understood. "She is wrong, wrong, wrong," I told her. "Boing," Og agreed. Mrs. Brisbane stopped pacing in front of my cage. "I shouldn't let it I shouldn't let her upset me. I think I understand her problem. I wasn't sure I wanted to understand Mrs. Wright, but I listened politely. She teaches games to her students all day long, but she never has any fun, she said. Yes, I squeaked. She's no fun at all. Mrs. Brisbane chuckled. Poor woman. I have an idea of just how to handle her. She smiled, picking up her handbag and left the classroom, still smiling. I was glad to see Mrs. Brisbane had an idea. Her ideas are almost always good. I just wish she had told me what it was. For the rest of the week, my friends worked hard. The boats looked good, but Richie and Gail didn't look any happier. Principal Morales stopped by room 26 one afternoon. He was wearing a tie that had little sailboats all over it. I've been hearing so much about these boats of yours, I had to come see for myself, he said. Everyone sat straight up and paid attention when Mr. Morales came to visit. After all, he was the most important person at Longfellow School. He was also a personal friend of mine. He took the time to look at each and every sailboat, and he always had something nice to say. They all look seaworthy, he announced when he was finished, and I should know, when I was your age, my friends and I spent half a summer building a raft. We couldn't wait to sail it on Potter's Pond. I guess I thought we'd be going like Huckleberry Finn. I'm sorry, I had no idea who Huckleberry Finn was, but I sure wanted to hear what happened. Mr. Morales continued. The raft was heavy, and it took 6 of us to carry it. We slipped the raft into the water and hopped on board. And guess what happened? None of my friends seemed to know, so he answered the question himself. It sank straight down. It's probably still lying at the bottom of the pond today. Amazing, he chuckled. Oh, no, Mrs. Brisbane exclaimed. It was disappointing, Mr. Morales continued, but I can assure you the water in Mrs. Potter's pond is very shallow. Mrs. Wright will be happy to hear that, Mrs. Brisbane said. It's also very muddy. My shoes got stuck in the sludge. I had to pull my feet out and go back with a shovel to dig them out, he chuckled again. My mama and papa were not pleased. Mrs. Brisbane and my classmates laughed too. Just make sure you've got a boat that floats, the principal continued. On his way to the door, he passed by my cage. How's it going, Humphrey? He asked. Where's your boat? That's what I'd like to know, I squeaked back. He laughed, so I guess he didn't actually understand what I was saying. But when I went into my sleeping hut for a nap, I kept picturing a raft laying at the bottom of Mrs. Potter's pond, just like the sunken boat in Mr. Fitch's tank. On Friday, after Mr. Brisbane and Mrs. Morgenstern left, Mrs. Brisbane made a surprising and shocking announcement. Class, we're so busy with our boats this week, I forgot to arrange anyone to take Humphrey home for the weekend. Phew! That statement took the wind out of my sails. For one thing, my classmates usually beg to take me home. For another thing, if nobody took me home, I could get awfully hungry and thirsty because I can't go without food and water as long as Og can. I can't believe we all forgot, Heidi said. Raise your hand, Heidi, Mrs. Brisbane reminded her. But don't worry, I'll be taking him home with me. I felt a lot better hearing that. But I felt worse when she said, I'm afraid there's no time for me to read aloud today. We'll continue with our book on Monday. No time to read aloud? Just when Uncle Jolly Roger and Vic and Vi were getting in great danger, I was about to squeak up in protest when the bell rang. Class was over and school was over. And soon as Mrs. Brisbane gathered up her jacket and books, we were on our way out of room 26 for the weekend. Farewell, matey, I called to Og. Boing, boing, he twanged in return. I wonder if that's how frogs say, aye, aye. Life at sea. It's either sink or swim, mateys. Sink or swim. From Jolly Roger's Guide to Life by Icy Waters. That was the end of chapter 6. Chapter 7 is titled An Unpleasant Discovery. So I hope you get to go outside and play today, make a pretty picture, do a math assignment outside. Enjoy it, guys. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.